I believe Bye. just a dream. I believe in love. I'm not the one you're looking for. I believe in love. Lift me. I
World on my shoulders, heart full of blues, I'm in the dirt, down in the dirt.